Hey guys, how you doing? This is Curtis from the Turks here with the second video in a multi-part series to kind of help, a new player get into the competitive scene and, try to get a little bit better at the game. So for today's episode, this is going to be like a crash course into the meta. So we're going to be talking about ice in particular. So the goal of this video is for you to kind of understand how ice works, and then also understand the kind of cards that you'll see when you're playing against ice and the different styles that the other player might be using. So we're going to talk about like forwards in the deck, backups in the deck, summons, and monsters. The main ones that you'll usually see that's being played in the meta. Obviously, we can't go through every single card. That'll be a little too long, and I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to watch that. But let's go ahead and get started. So the first card that we're going to talk about is Genesis, and I think that this is the card that kind of identifies ice. It's basically played in every single ice deck that you're going to play against, and there's good reason for it. It's a very good card. So basically what Genesis does is when it enters the field, they pick one of your forwards, and they'll dull and freeze it. And then if they hit you, not only do you take a point of damage, but you also have to discard a card from your hand. So if this guy stays on the board and you don't deal with him, he's going to be taking a card out every single turn. And then from there you just lose advantage and you're just not able to fight back. And that's basically what ice kind of does in a nutshell. They just make you discard cards, they dull your cards, and then they freeze your cards as well. And Genesis is basically the best definition of what ice is. So how do you play around Genesis? So for one, there are some cards that just cannot be dulled, and that's a lot of what Earth has, like 5-drop Yang or 4-drop Guy, things like that. So obviously those cards are really good against cards like Genesis. They just can't do anything to it. However, if you're not playing Earth, that's not a very viable option for you. So, what else can you do? Well, one, if you have any way to reactivate any forward, that's going to be a good card for this kind of situation here. So when they try to swing in, you can find some way to reactivate them and then just block, and then you'll be okay. If you don't have reactivation, the next best thing, you just play a forward that's bigger or as strong as Genesis. So, if you're playing against Mono Ice, there is no way that they can give it haste unless they're playing a different color. And at that point, when they play the Genesis, you know that it's there, and you know that you have at least one turn to deal with it. So the best thing you can do, just play another forward, something that you can either trade with or just outright kill Genesis, so that way, unless they have like a Mateus or they have some kind of way to dull that one, at that point you're going to be okay, and then you can start to build your hand back. The next set of forwards that we're going to be talking about are going to be a couple of them, and it's basically the Final Fantasy VI package. With the Final Fantasy VI package, the reason why I included it in this list is if you see one of these, you'll know that you're playing against tempo ice. And basically what that means, it's a little slower build, but they kind of try to grind you out, and then they just kind of pick your cards off one by one, like cards in your hand, and at that point they just keep on building up resources while you're struggling. And then the Final Fantasy VI package basically gives everything that they need to kind of grind you out, and then also to get that advantage. So you'll see cards like Celis, Locke, and Setzer. Setzer basically searches for any Final Fantasy VI character, which is pretty broken, and that includes the backups too, so that's one way that they can start to ramp up against you. Best way to deal with Setzer, just straight up remove him from the field, so like cards like Shantoto or like maybe 4-drop Bahamut that would kill it and just remove from the game. At that point you don't have to worry about that additional effect of it trying to freeze and dull a character on the board. And then cards like Locke, the way to play around that is just don't let them have more than 2 other Final Fantasy VI characters on the board. So that way you can try to, if they are forced to play Locke, they kind of lose that extra value of them getting rid of that card from your hand. Now for Celis, this one's a little bit more difficult to kind of deal with just because it's very strong, and it's probably Ice's strongest forward other than like Orphan. But basically, Celis is good too because, if you're playing against Ice, you kind of have to be careful about how you start the game, because if you start one backup, there's a good chance that they might just play Celis first turn, freeze that card, and now you're reset. Because basically when your turn starts, that backup is not going to activate, and if you want to play something else, you're going to have to discard from your hand again. So if you're playing that one backup, most likely you were thinking about playing a 3-drop forward or like a 3-drop backup to kind of ramp up, but now you can't do that, because if you do, you're going to be discarding an extra card just to play it, so you're going to be wasting some CP, and that's just why Celis is pretty good. And then also it cancels your summons too, so that's an extra thing you have to worry about. And then Celis is also very combo heavy too, so when she does damage, she deals something 4,000 damage if it's dulled, and at that point they can combo it with like a 4 like Sid Reigns and make you discard even another card. One way that you can deal with Celis is if you're playing like Earth or anything like that, if you have like a Dataluma on board and you already swung with them, if they swing a Celis, they have to choose them and they have to deal it damage. So if they don't have Duke Larg out, you can basically just kill this just for a point of damage. And if they know what they're doing, they probably won't even swing. So it's probably one good way to deal with that kind of situation. Alright, so the next card is kind of straightforward. If you see it played against you, you automatically know what it does. When it hits the board, you discard a card. And then if you have 2 or less cards, he gains 4,000, and that puts him at 5k, which is really annoying for a 2-drop. Especially if they have multiple of this, which is why he's on this list. It's a multi-card, so that means they can play up to 3 copies of this card on the board at one time. So don't get comfortable if you see one. There's a good chance they probably have another one that they're going to play, so you have to be very careful about that. And then once you're in a situation of where you're low on cards, if they party attack with 2 of these guys, it's going to be 10k. And then if you have to block, it's not going to feel great, because no one wants to lose a 3-drop or a 4-drop forward to a bunch of 2-drops, especially when they're like small little weenies like that. But the main reason why he's there is because that whole strategy of discarding cards kind of leads to one of the big boss monsters in Ice, and this is definitely something that's being played in both styles of Ice. That's going to be Sid Alstein. So basically what he does is when you play him on the board, you get to break a forward if they have no cards in hand. And against Ice, that's very easy and very common to happen. So you do have to be very careful, and you always have to keep it in the back of your mind. If I play this forward and I'm left with no cards in my hand, if they play Sid Alstein, will I lose? So if the answer is yes, and you can avoid it, and you can get some way to put the card back in your hand or something like that, then you might be okay, but you want to be very careful about what you play against Ice, especially if you have no hand. One way to get around this is this effect does go on the stack, so that means before it even happens, you can go ahead and activate an effect that could possibly put a card back into your hand, so that way you can fizzle it. So let's say that you're playing water, like let's say Wind, Ice, Vikings, let's say. And you got that important Cloud of Darkness there, and you need it on board, and then they play the Sid Alstein against you, and you have no cards in your hand. If you're playing Scholar, what you could do is you can use that Scholar, bounce back, let's say, a Viking back to your hand. At that point, that goes off before the Sid goes off. And at that point, when the Viking leaves, you draw cards, and now you're at 2 cards. And then the effect will fizzle, you keep your Cloud of Darkness, and next turn you can play that Viking again, draw a card, and then start swinging and, minusing things off the board. So that's one way that you can deal with Sid Alstein. But also keep in mind that they can do the same thing against you. So if you have, maybe 2 cards in your hand and they have 2 Flans out, and then they play this card, they can do the same exact thing. They can use the Flans to get rid of the cards before that effect goes off, and now that you have no cards, they can break the forward. So just keep that in mind when you are playing around this card. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the backups, and these are very common backups you're going to see against Ice. Now, if you see the Harley, you know for a fact that they're going to be playing this Edward here, which is a 3-drop. Basically, Harley speaks for herself, so I'm not going to even explain what it really does. But when Edward comes into the board, it makes you discard a card, and then they can stop a summon if they have another copy of Edward. So you always have to be careful against Ice, especially if Edward is already active. If you have a summon in your hand that you really need to play, and if it gets negated, you're just going to straight up lose, you might not want to play it, and you might want to hold on to it until they make the mistake of maybe dulling it themselves when they pay CP to play another card. Or the other best thing you can do, well, the best thing to do is check the break zone, check to see if they already discarded a copy of Edward, check their deck size, see what the chances that they might have another Edward or seen one, and then check the damage zone to see if you already hit them for a point of damage, which shows that the Edward is gone. So if they have an Edward on board, which is completely active, and then the break zone has one Edward and there's another Edward in the damage zone, well, that's 3. You know for a fact that they can't stop the summon, so at that point you can do whatever you want. And I can guarantee you in the meta, keyword in the meta, no one else is playing more Edwards than this card here, so you're not going to get like a surprise Edward out of nowhere. Alright, so one of the main cards in Ice, and it has been for the longest time, is Devout. And Devout is a very, very strong card. Basically what it does is when you dull it and use its effect, you get to bring back any forward period, so it doesn't even have to be Ice. It could be anything. So if they somehow splash something else, it's probably going to be coming on the board for free. And if it has like a an auto ability that triggers when it's being played, they get to use that again. So like the Genesis, maybe a Lock or a Celis or anything like that. Those are very, very strong cards when they're played for the first time, and Devout can basically reuse that effect and really blow you out if you're not careful. So the best way to deal with this is, for one, they can only use it during their turn. So this is something that you have to keep in mind and deal with once they start doing things on their turn there. So you don't have to worry about a surprise Genesis dulling and freezing your card during your turn or during your battle phase. That's just not possible. But so, basically during your turn you can do whatever you need to do to set up against whatever kind of forward that might be playing. So if you just look through a break zone, look through every forward that's going to be 4 or less, you can kind of see what their options are, and then from there adjust accordingly whatever you're playing with. There are a couple cards that do just straight out negate this card entirely, so if they play Devout for the first time or they already have it active and you're playing Earth, you could always use a 3-drop Hecagon Chair and just break it, so that way you don't even have to deal with it. You can also, if you're playing Water, the new Leviathan from Opus 6 cancels an action ability, and Devout is an action ability. And that's going to kind of blow them out, especially if they're using that for a big Renoa play. That's definitely something that you can do to stop Devout and make sure that it's not really a game changer like it usually is. Alright, and this card right here is one of the few defense options that Ice has at its disposal. It's a very common 2-drop and is very good, and it's basically been here since the start of the game. When it enters the board, they pick up to 2 forwards and they freeze them. And then, if you start swinging too aggressively and this comes off the top, well, then that's 2 cards that just can't block next turn, and, you're going to be in trouble if you don't play something else. The special as well is something that can blow out a game as well. If they pitch another copy of Jill and pay 1 Ice and then dull Jill Navat, they can basically pick one of your forwards and dull and freeze it. So common theme of Ice, dulling and freezing cards. So that's one way to deal with it. Well, one way that they're going to try to beat you with this card. Best way to play around this, find some way to reactivate your forwards. There's really not much you can do, honestly, other than that. So if you do have some way to reactivate cards, any card in Ice that dulls and freezes is just completely worthless. They just basically played a card that just targeted your card and did nothing. So if you are playing anything like Wind, or if you're playing Water and you have like the backup Astrologian, and then that activates a forward, or if you're playing like Ash or anything like that, you don't really have to worry about Ice too much because you're already predisposed to kind of beat their core strategy. Alright, now we're going to talk about the summons. This is probably the most common Ice summon that you're going to see consistent between both builds, and there's a very good reason for it. It's a very good card. It's a modular card, so it has different effects that they can do. And then keep in mind, for these cards, it always happens in order. So they can't be like, I'm gonna dull this and then deal something else 7k or something like that. It has to, when you activate the card, the targets have to be legal the first time, so they can't just dull it first and then deal that same target 7,000 damage. That's just not possible. So if anyone tries to do that against you, you can politely tell them that that's an illegal play. But you do have to be very careful about this card, because if you swing with something that is at 7k, they can just punish you and kill the card and make you discard. So if you have any way to reactivate that forward when you swing, That's one way you can get around this summon here, because in order for you to be dealt the 7,000, that target has to be dulled. So by the time that this card resolves, if that card is active, it just basically fizzles out. Alright, so this card is very annoying, and it basically made Turbo Ice what it is at the start of Opus 5, and it definitely made Ice more oppressive. If you don't know, what it does is basically if you block, they will break it for 1 CP, which is very, very good. Now, what are some ways to play around this? One is you basically just kill their forward before you block, and that way you get to keep yours, and Mateus fizzles out, just because in order for it to actually break, the block has to happen. So if they swing with like a really weak forward, like let's say Argeth, and then you're playing, I don't know, let's say like a wall. If they swing and you block, and then they activate Mateus, you can actually, you know, chain or add to the stack, let's say 2-drop Hekaton Chair, just break it, and then that way you get to keep your wall for next turn and they wasted Mateus. Another good example could be like if you're playing like Wind Earth and you're playing against Ice and you have Dataluma and Cactar. If they swing with like a Genesis or something like that, and then they play Mateus, Mateus will target Dataluma, so that will trigger the 4K, and then if you have Cactar, you can ping that to your Dataluma and deal another 4K, which will deal that Genesis 8,000, which will kill the card, and then that way the Mateus fizzles again, the block never happens, and you get to keep your forward, and that's going to set them back tremendously. Alright, so this card right here is, in my opinion, the bane of a lot of new players, just because new players do not play around Shiva. So when you're at like 5 or 6 damage and the opponent has 2 or 3 forwards, you cannot swing if it would remain only 2 forwards on your side that would be able to block, because if they do play Shiva, you just automatically lose, which does happen quite a bit. So the best way to play around that is if you have multiple forwards, just swing once at a time. You don't want to be blown out by a Shiva. And like always, check their break zone, check their damage zone, see if they've already gotten rid of copies, and if their deck is very small and you don't see any of them, they probably have them in the hand. And it really comes down to, if a list is playing the Shiva, but I guarantee if you're playing against Turbo Ice, they are going to be playing Shiva, and if you're playing against Tempo Ice, there's a good chance that they are playing this card, but not all builds do play it. So just keep that in mind. Never leave just 1 or 2 forwards to block, especially if you're at 6. It's just too risky. Alright, and this card here, it's not played too much in the meta right now, but I wanted to include it just because it is the only board wipe that Ice has as disposal. So if you're if you don't know that this card exists, you're going to be playing into it, and that's going to blow you out, especially if you have a bunch of 2-drops or 3-drops or even 5-drops. Basically what this does, it breaks all those dull forwards of those costs, so you have to be very careful that you're not swinging with everything at once, because if they use that card, you probably will lose, especially if they already have a board established up and they've already dealt you points of damage. So just keep that in mind going forward. Try not to swing too much with everything at once, especially if you have a really important card. You probably want to keep that active and just swing with everything else if you know that they're playing Zalera, so that way they get kind of frustrated and they might be forced to play it without optimal targets. Alright, so now we're going to be talking about the monsters, and the monsters are actually a vital part of Ice, just because this is the kind of the way that they keep their main strategy going. So the first one we're going to be talking about is Gesper. And this is a multi-card, so that means they can have multiple copies at once, and this card is very, very, very annoying. You'll see Gesper being played in Turbo Ice, not Tempo Ice, just because they have to discard as well, so they're trying to build resources, so they don't want to be discarding, they just want you to discard. But for Turbo Ice, they don't care, just because they want you in top deck mode, and everything that they play in top deck mode is accessible to them each turn. So you do have to be very careful about this card, especially if they play it early. And the ways to play around it is you can activate things on the stack, especially if anything that would return a card back to the hand. You can make them basically get rid of cards that they don't want to, things that they weren't really expecting. So if they use Gesper and they have no hand, before you discard, before you let it resolve, if you have a way to bounce something back, so let's say you're playing against water, then you have like a Bismarck in your hand, you can actually chain Bismarck to Gesper, and you can bounce back that same Jesper that's been activated back to the hand, and then it still happens because it's on the stack. No one can stop that, so they end up discarding that same copy, and that way you don't have to deal with it next turn. So that's one good way that you can, handle this card, especially if you're playing water. If you're playing lightning or anything like that, Ramu, just go ahead and break Jesper. You don't want this to be constantly discarding cards out your hand, and then that way you can actually start to build back up. So that's probably the best way to get around this card. But be very careful about it, especially if you don't play backups. You're going to be in a lot of trouble if your deck doesn't have a lot of 2-drops or 1-drops or things like that. Alright, so the other monster that's played in Ice, and this is going to be Flan. Like Jesper, it is a multi-card, so they're going to have up to 3 copies. Now this card is played in both Turbo Ice and Tempo Ice, so if you're trying to distinguish between which build you're playing against, you won't know just by seeing this card. But what it does is they can dull it and get rid of it and make you discard a card, or they can pay 1 ice and dull it and they search for another copy and they put it in their hand. So you have to be very careful about this card. If they start searching for more copies of Flan, they're basically setting up for a big play, and they can potentially make you discard 3 cards at once. So you have to be very careful about that. And then also, like before, when I talked about Sid Alstein, they can use this card to basically do the same play that I was mentioning earlier. They can make you discard your hand before that effect resolves, so that way they end up still killing the forward. There really isn't any real way to play around this card, just because they are going to make you discard, period. So unless you have a way to kill it, early off, you should be okay. Just because for Flan, you can only use that effective discard during that Ice player's turn, so they can't do it during your turn. So if you feel like you don't want them to be discarding the important cards in your hand, you might want to just play everything. So if you decide to hold your cards, then just be aware that it's a possibility that it might be gone. And then the last monster we'll talk about with Ice is Buckaboo. This one is starting to fall off a little bit, but basically if you play any character while this is on the board, it's going to break, and then they're just going to make you discard 2 cards. So you have to be very careful. You probably don't want to play something too expensive early on, especially at the start of the game, because that could potentially get rid of your whole hand, and then you'll be really behind. The best way to play around this card is, you might as well just play like a 2-drop, and then at that point just discard extra cards, because if you think about it, if they discard to play this card first turn, they've already gotten rid of cards too. So if you do the math during your testing, you'll see that if you play something cheap, you'll end up with the same amount of cards as the Ice player does. So you just have to be careful about building on from that point. Alright, so now that we talked about the cards that people are going to be playing in Ice, let's go ahead and take a look at some lists. So this is the list that won Gen Con, was played by Jordan Dank, and this is the pinnacle of Turbo Ice discard, basically. So if you can see here, if we look at the forwards first, we got 3 Snows, 3 Argets, 3 Deep Ground Soldiers, 3 Squalls, 3 Thaumaturge, 3 of the 3-drop Deep Ground Soldier, 1 Laguna, Zidane, and then more Deep Ground Soldiers, and you can basically read down the list. And as you can see, 3 Genesis, like I said, very important card. It's going to be used in every single Ice list that you will ever look at, and if they aren't playing that card, then you have to be, it's probably not a meta deck at that point. And you can see there the 3 Sid Alsteins as well. So if we take that forward list and dissect it, what is it trying to do? Well, you got the Argets, you got the Thaumaturge, and then you have the Zidane as well. So there's a lot of cards that discard, and they're 2-drops, so they're very cheap. So if you think about it, first turn they can make you discard 3 cards at once. If they have an Argeth and 2 Thaumaturge, or they have 3 Thaumaturge, they could make you get rid of 3 cards off the bat, and then that's going to put you behind, and you have to be very careful how you build up. And in this situation here, when they play those cheap cards, they're able to kind of get cards back at the same time, and that's what this build of Turbo Ice does. And the way that they do that is with the Jesper and the Deep Ground Soldier. So if you remember what we talked about before with the Jesper, when you can activate effects on the stack to either put cards back to the hand to make them discard the same card, or if you flip it around, you can actually do a search and then do the Jesper. So that way the Jesper goes out first, both players discard a card, and then the search happens and you put a card back. So you can kind of cheat it that way. And that's what the Deep Ground Soldiers do in this build. When you play that Deep Ground Soldier, you have no cards now because you're top decking 2 cards, right? So 2 CP, play the 2 CP. 2 CP searches out. Now that doesn't happen immediately because you can put stuff to happen before that occurs, and that's what we call the stack. So they can do the stack on Jesper. Jesper goes off first. Both players discard. Now you add a card back, and now you're 1 card ahead of the opponent, and then you just keep on going like that, and then that's how Turbo Ice basically wins. And then you have cards like Snow, which basically dull a forward if they do play something, so it's just constant damage. And this deck wins very fast. Don't be surprised if you see someone playing against this deck and they lose in like 3 or 4 minutes. It's very common. And then if you take a look at the summons, you'll see that this also plays 3 Mateus and 3 Shiva. Like I said, those summons are very common with Ice, especially in Turbo Discard, so when you're trying to play forwards to prevent them from hitting you, all they have to do is just play the Mateus, break that card, or just dull it and just start swinging through. So it's just constant damage every turn if possible. They only play 9 backups, and at that point you see the Harley and the Edward, like I said, common cards in the meta. And they're going to be basically trying to make you discard as much as possible while it's a cheap way to ramp up for them, so that way they can actually play 4 drops really easily. And then maybe a 5-drop as well if they have at least 1 backup. And then they can also stop your summons too, which is also pretty annoying for you if you have something that needs to, completely kill everything. So if you're playing like Lightning and you want to do an Exodus and break all the 2-drops, they might cancel that card if they have Edward active. So you have to be very careful about that, and you kind of have to do what you need to do to survive at some point. But keep in mind that that is something that is very real if it does happen. So how do you play against this deck, and how do you beat this deck? Well, if you think about the strategy of the deck, all it's trying to do is put you in top deck mode, so that way every turn you're only starting with 2 cards. So if you keep in mind that if you haven't played any backups and you just have 2 cards, automatically you're locked into playing 2 drops. You can't play anything else if you have nothing else on board. Just because you have 1 card, 2 CP, another card, 2 CP. So if you want to play something, you have to get rid of one of those cards and play the other card. But if you're not able to play those cards, you can't do anything. You have to pass. And then next turn, hopefully you keep those cards and you draw into 2 more. But if they have that Jesper, 2 of them, they're just going to keep on making you discard, so you'll never be able to play anything while they're just playing more stuff. And that's usually how this deck wins. Just because most decks in the meta right now, a lot of cards are 3 drops, 4 drops, even 5 drops, and 6 drops, and 7 drops, anything from there. Not a lot of people play too many 2 drops or 1 drops, especially forwards. They do play 2-drop backups and things like that. But if you don't see any of them, or if you decide to play a forward instead, you might end up locking yourself out of potentially even winning the game. A lot of players I see when they play against Turbo Ice, they opt to play a forward first. That's probably not the best way to do it, just because they can instantly play a Sid Allstate and just kill it, and now you have no cards. Just because you decide to play the 4-drop forward and you ditched your hand to do it, you have literally nothing, and they still have everything on their board, and that's just an easy win for them. So what do you have to do? You have to build up your backups. You have to know how much backups you need on your board to consistently play anything that you're going to play in your deck. So if your deck has mostly 4 drops, you need at least 2 backups. So that way when you draw into your 4-drop, you can just play that card, and then next turn, if it dies, you can just play the other 4-drop that you have, maybe that you'll draw into. So that's basically the best way to do it. So if you're playing a bunch of like 5 drops or 3 drops, you might want to build up to 3, and I'd actually recommend build up 3 anyways, just because that will let you be able to play pretty much anything that you want in a given turn. It's gonna feel really weird, especially if they're hitting you for points of damage each turn. You kind of have to just suck it up and just tell yourself, I need to set up so that way I can play something instead. Because if you think about it, the cards that you draw are better than the cards that they draw. It's just that they can play them and you can't. So if you are able to play them, I guarantee you a Dataluma is much better than just 1 Thaumaturge. So at that point, you need to make sure that you're building up to where you can play your own cards, because your own cards are going to be better than theirs. Theirs is just, there for value and there for damage. So just you have the better deck overall. You just have to be able to play it. So that's probably the best way to deal with Turbo Ice. Just build up your backups, and then just try to make sure that your forwards stick. If you play a lot of experts in your deck, that's also going to help you out. So if they start ditching their hand to play these cheap cards to make you discard and they end up losing them to your experts, then you're going to be in a much better spot if you're building up backup, so that way you can start to turn the game around. And then for any deck that's playing Earth, if you play like Wall, you probably want to just play first turn Wall against Turbo Ice, just because it's very hard for them to deal with that card other than Mateus. At that point, when your turn comes up, if you draw into 2 and you already have 1 card in your hand, that's 3. All those Argus, well, Thaumaturge will be at 1,000 and Argus is already at 3 and Snow's at 3. You just use your effect at the start of the combat phase. You just deal something 3,000 and you get to kill something for free and keep your card. And then that's another thing that they have to either party attack to get over, or they have to just sit there and let you build cards back up. And that's probably the best way to do it. Alright, and the next list is going to be a Tempo Ice build. I played this list at the Maryland local qualifier where I got top 8. Technically would have been top 4 cut, just because of the amount of people. But basically what this build does, it's not like Turbo Ice where they're just constantly trying to make you discard cards. I'm still going to make you discard cards and I'm still going to dull and free stuff, but it's much more smarter. Basically I'm trying to play the long game and I'm trying to make sure to starve you out, and then from there I'll have a bigger board and I can just basically, grind out any game that I can. So if you look at the list here, you'll see the Final Fantasy VI package, like I said. Tempo Ice always plays a Final Fantasy VI package. It's very good for what it's trying to do. You got the Celis, you got the Locks, you got the Setzer there. And then also for the backups, you have like, the Justilian Empire Sid, which is that Final Fantasy VI Searcher, like I mentioned before. The Setzer can search that out, and it's just value overall. You got a lot of cards that kind of combo off each other, so like Celis and the Sid Rings, like I mentioned before. You swing with the Celis, deal something 4,000, that's dull, and then you play the Sid Rings, kill that same card, and then make them discard out of it. So there's a lot of value plays there. And then the Orphan, since you're playing only light blue cards, every time you play it, if you already have a board set up, it's going to automatically dull and freeze 2 4s on the opponent's side, and then every time that they swing, they'll just freeze something, and then you're just going to be locked out and you'll never be able to fight back. And then if you look at the summons here, you'll see the Glacia Libolis, very common summon. And you'll see the Zalera, which is that board wipe. I opted to play it, Cody opted to play it, and I don't disagree. It's very good for what it does, and it's a good way to get rid of Camelot too. So just be careful about like all the cards that you have. So if you are playing any deck that plays Camelot, and if you don't know what it does, it's a 5-drop. 9k basically searches out for any dark card in your deck, and then also when your turn comes up again, you pick any color, and then you cannot target it with that color. So if you're playing against Ice and you play Camelot, if it survives, you want it to be Ice, so that way they can't target it with any dull freeze effects, they can't dull it with a Shiva, they can't kill it with a Sid Alstein, they can't do anything to it, they have to try to kill it by battle, or they can Zalera it if you're not careful and you decide to swing with your Camelot. Right? So play around that. If you think that they're playing Zalera, you probably don't want to attack with Camelot at all, because that's your best defense against everything in the deck that it's trying to do. So just keep that in mind. That's one way to kind of play around Tempo Ice. But overall, against Tempo Ice, it's pretty hard to play against. It really comes down to the skill of the player. If you're playing against an average Ice player, it's kind of easy to beat them. All you have to do is basically be the aggressor. Ice has no defense, even the Turbo Ice builds, if you look at this build here. They have no way to deal with an established board. Sure, they can use Genesis to dull and freeze it, but it doesn't get rid of the card. The only card that gets rid of things would be Sid Alstein, but if you have a hand, that card's worthless. So they're basically left to just Mateus, and if you decide not to block, well, they're still not going to kill a card, and if they're losing already, they can't block you. So at that point, if you're playing against, an average Ice player, if you're being the aggressor and you're the one that's doing the damage and being aggressive, they don't have any ways to fight back, basically, other than maybe a Jill and a bot. So you have to be, mindful of that too. But if you aren't playing against an average Ice player, you're playing against a very good Ice player, at that point you have to play the value game better than they can. So if they have, if they play like a Glacia Libolis and deal something 7k, make your discard. If you have a way to reactivate the card, then you just make it fizzle out, and that way you don't have to lose the card, and that way you can actually, make them lose value by even playing the card instead. Same thing with the Final Fantasy VI package. If you have a way to get rid of one of those cards so that way they can't play the lock, you can set them back a turn so that way they don't actually play the card, because most likely they don't want to lose value. They want you to discard. So that's one way to kind of slow them down and turn the game back in your favor. They will also try to build a lot of backups. So if you can force them in this position where they can't really build up too much, you can probably take a game off of them, especially if you are playing smart and making sure that anything that they play doesn't really get value. Cards like Lua, Mono Lightning, very good because they can't really get rid of it easily. Ice has very low amounts of removal. So if you can see the Turbo Ice build here, like I said, Mateus is the only real removal, Sid Alstein is the only real removal. They don't really have anything else, so if you take a look at that, there's really only 2 cards in the deck that can actually kill something outright. So that way, if you keep that in mind, if you have a really big problem card that they need to get rid of, if you play smart, they can't really get rid of it. And if you look at this build here, with the Tempo Ice, same thing. The only thing that can really just straight out break something is going to be Sid Alstein, the Zalera, maybe the Glacial Bolas, but you can play around that by reactivating the forward, so that way you can't deal damage to a dull forward because it's not dulled. And then combo damage with like Celis and the Sid Reigns. Other than that, they can't really kill anything, and if you've noticed, the theme is any kind of damage done to a forward from ice, it has to be dulled. So the best way to get around that, don't dull your stuff. So if you have a way to give something brave, you can basically shut ice out of their entire removal strategy, and you can always make sure that your cards always survive. Or if it's a card that, like Dataluma, where it has an additional effect if it's targeted or dealt damage, that's going to be your best bet, and that's, probably one of Ice's biggest counters, to be honest. So, that's one way to play around it. But if you're not playing those colors and you're playing something else, just take a look at your cards, see if anything reactivates, see if anything bounces it back to your hand, so that way you can avoid things being destroyed. If you have any way to just draw back cards, so anything that you had to discard before, you just get it right back. So like the Viking Layla package, very good against ice. If they're making you discard a couple cards and you just basically draw them right back, and now you have blockers, they kind of really didn't do anything. So that's one thing to consider too. But overall, I hope this video helped you out. Hopefully pretty much the main cards in Ice now, especially if you're a newer player. So if you see any light blue cards being played, hopefully you know exactly what to look out for, what kind of cards are going to be playing against you, and hopefully if you see a couple cards, you'll know which type of Ice deck you're playing against, and from there you can adjust and keep the cards you need or get rid of the cards that you don't need. I think we're going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for watching. The next video will be about Lightning. So if you have any problems against that matchup, or you just want more knowledge about that color, stay tuned and we'll go ahead and get that taken care of for you. Thanks.